Holy crap. Everyone told me that beams are a horrible idea. I'm starting to believe them. Every time I drive this project car, I'm all nerves. My partner asked me why that is, and I told her that I just have this paranoia that some major component like the engine or the axles is just gonna fall off of this thing. I have never seen a 6BT Cummins in such a small vehicle, so it's kind of one of a kind. This engine weighs 3 times what the stock engine did. On top of that, I decided I would challenge myself and use TTB suspension or beam suspension instead of just using a straight solid axle. I think beam suspension has a lot of advantages, and I wanted the challenge of trying to make it work rather than just taking the road less traveled and doing a solid axle like everyone else does. With this one-of-a-kind drivetrain and unique front suspension setup, I'm always worried that the worst is gonna happen. My partner thought that I was being ridiculous, that I was worried something would fall off, but maybe I wasn't quite so paranoid. I may have bit off more than I could chew. After my most recent test drive, I got this thing home and looked under it, and some of the welds holding the suspension on were cracked all the way through. That was a very concerning thing to find on this. Maybe I was justified in some of my paranoia. When I was building this thing, I did almost all the welding myself, minus a few parts that I could con my partner into doing since she actually used to be a real welder, not a fake welder like me. When I set out to build this thing, I needed to buy a welder, and my partner convinced me that MIG is Barbie Playhouse welding, it doesn't count as real welding, and that I needed to buy a TIG and stick machine. Prior to this Explorer, all of my welding experience was MIG. So that's what I did, and then I taught myself to TIG and stick on this project car. That may have been a mistake. When you look at the issue with the welds on this suspension, it's very clear that it's a me issue. In general, a good weld is a lot stronger than the surrounding material, but when you look at this weld failure, it is cracked right through the center of the weld. That means that there was either a heat or a technique issue, not necessarily a joint issue. It means that the monkey holding the welding torch was the one who made the mistake. Probably what happened is when I was trying to TIG weld this, I was just too hot on the pedal and roasted the crap out of these welds. Made them way too hot. This is particularly embarrassing because I had even flipped the chassis upside down to make sure I could get the easiest weld possible, just a nice horizontal weld. Somehow I still managed to screw it up. Now that the car's all put together, I'm not gonna be able to flip the chassis over to redo these welds again. I'm gonna have to do these welds overhead, which is way more difficult than the horizontal welds that I had already screwed up. It's time to stop screwing around. I know that I can lay a decent MIG bead, so I'm just gonna use MIG. My parents own a manufacturing plant, and there was this dusty old MIG machine that had been sitting in the back of their warehouse for years. I knew this because when I worked there, I was the one who bought it. But since I left, nobody's used it. So I helped them clean up their warehouse a little bit by taking the MIG welder off their hands. Now I finally have a MIG machine, and not only that, but it was the right price.
Okay, maybe I was being a little dramatic. If you look at the spot right there, that is awful. But then there's all of that. There is still a whole lot of weld holding this bracket on, so I don't think it was actually going to fall off.
I'm confident that with MIG, I can redo these welds myself. I'm going to grind them out, and then I'm going to lay multiple passes down and get a nice meaty throat on each of these welds. Then, even though this was a weld issue and not a joint design issue, I'm going to go in and plate and reinforce everywhere that it cracked. And I'm gonna add additional plates to change the joint design to a slightly better design. I know the joint failed because of the weld, so if I just put a decent weld down, that should be good enough, but I want this thing to be overkill. I don't ever want to question the integrity of the front suspension of this thing again. I want to be confident that it works. When you look at these pivot mounts, the purpose of the pivot mount is to take forces side to side. That is really the only thing these pivots do. They don't hold the weight of the vehicle, that's what the springs do. And they don't take force front to back, that's what the radius arms do. Their purpose is to take side to side lateral forces. So I'm going to truss each of these brackets side to side with 1/4 inch plate. Side to side is what the load path is, and 1/4 inch is way overkill, that's super thick. So this should take these pivots from acceptable to overkill, which is what I want. While I was putting the beams back in, I actually realized part of what my problem was. The passenger side beam had been running into the engine crossmember. Now, I didn't set up my bump stops properly because I wasn't really doing any hardcore wheeling yet, but somehow, I guess just parking on a hill or something, I managed to hit the bump, The beam hit the axle, and that's probably part of the reason this thing cracked. Metal to metal contact causes a lot of impulse and imparts a lot of force into joints. I need to adjust my radius arms to move my axle forward so it cannot contact the engine cross member. I got it to the point where it'll rest all the way up on this tiny little bump stop before it ever collides with the engine cross member, but I'm also going to add taller bump stops in the future to provide even more safety. Since I had everything apart anyways, I figured now was a really good time to address some steering issues I've had. This Explorer is kind of like Zoolander. It doesn't turn right very well. And the reason why is because my steering is limited. My steering angle is not what it should be. What's limiting the steering angle is that I had to take the steering box and move it to the outside of the frame in order to fit the big Cummins engine in the center of the frame. What that meant was that my tie rods were too short and I wasn't quite getting the reach to turn it all the way bump to bump on both sides. I'm gonna extend this tie rod in order to get that extra reach. One thing I love about TTB suspension is, in my experience, it turns on a dime. That's something I loved about my original high school Explorer, and I was really disappointed that this build didn't have the same feature. So hopefully what this does is takes it back to the stock-like experience of having a really solid turning radius, because that's one thing I love about TTB and I want to retain that. The way I extended this was I cut up some 1/4-inch wall tube, and then I got an adapter for a GM 1-ton tie rod, and then of course a new tie rod end. This tie rod is what goes into the steering arm. All in all, I extended this by about 5 inches, and then I also have some additional adjustability on the length because the tie rod end is threaded. While I was in here, I also realized that the old inner tie rod had a ton of slop in it. It was totally hooped, so I replaced that while I was at it. Working on suspension and steering is kind of back-breaking work, so I'm absolutely exhausted. It's not that bad when you have normal size components underneath your rig, but once you start doing 3/4 ton, 1-ton axles and things, stuff gets heavy and it gets hard to work on. Stuff like this would be way easier with a lift, but I hope that my videos show that even in a garage, you can do all this stuff. You don't need a lift. This thing is strong back, and that builds up over time the more you do it anyways, so get out there and do it. It may not seem like it in a YouTube video, but this thing's been sitting on jack stands for weeks. I am really glad to have it back on its wheels and to be confident again that the steering and suspension works. This thing went from being a complete project car to having the whole front end ripped out of it way too quickly. And that's kind of a horrible feeling to take that many steps backwards on your project. I'm really glad to be back at a point where it seems more complete. Eventually, the perseverance and the grit will pay off. I keep having all these issues with it, but I'm gonna keep fixing them as they come up. I'm not gonna stop playing whack-a-mole with all these issues that keep popping up. I'm going to make this project car work. This thing is gonna hit some trails, it's gonna do some overlanding. We will get there eventually. I will not stop until that happens. I'd love to take this for a test drive today, but unfortunately the turbo and a whole bunch of other parts of the engine are sitting on my bench, and we'll talk more about why next time. Until then, thanks for hanging out with me in my garage today. Now, get out there and build something. I hope to see you next time.